everyone, my name is Maria Raczynska and today we're going to paint this pumpkin. Actually, this is the pumpkin, and to make things easier, I took a photo of it first. And so I have it perfectly settled, and you can see this photo in the video as well. And I was changing the position of the pumpkin just to get a little bit of those highlights. So I got some highlights in there too. And when you take a look at the highlights, you notice maybe a little bit of blue in there, which is why I'm going to use some phthalo blue for the highlights. Now, let's start from the beginning though, how I'm going to paint this pumpkin. I'm going to paint this pumpkin wet on wet, which means I'm going to wet the entire pumpkin and apply the colors wet on wet. This is going to be 2 layers, and I'm going to start with undertones. So I'm going to start with the lightest colors I can see first. And this includes those blue highlights. So sometimes whenever I see a blue highlight, I'll actually add some red to it. So if I need any red, it's going to be quinacridone red. Now, you can choose any red you want. You can choose any colors you want. You don't have to use the same colors. You can come up with your own color palette. But for the pumpkin itself, like for that first layer, I'm gonna create that yellowish layer, including those bluish undertones. So for the highlights, and I'm gonna use for that phthalo blue and red shade, and then quinacridone red. So red and blue, and then a primary yellow, which is imidazoline yellow, and then tiny bit of iso yellow, which will be used later for the patches, the orange patches that we see on the pumpkin, and then you can use one of these, for example, yellow ochre or raw sienna. I have both on my palette already squeezed, so I might just use both of these colors. So whenever I mix colors, I actually mix them on the paper. I try to do all the mixing on the paper instead of my palette. That's how you avoid muddiness of colors. So the first thing is to squeeze your colors onto the palette and then dilute your colors with water to what I call heavy cream-like ratio. So think of dairy. That's how I like to call it, because the consistency, it feels kind of like heavy cream. And I don't want these colors to be too diluted with water. That's because I'm going to apply colors wet on wet, and I do want to have some control, right? At the beginning, I might use a little more water with the paint, just so the paint does spread, because you do want some paint to spread. But then as you keep moving and applying the colors, let's say you want one area to show more of the raw sienna with iso yellow, for example, then you want to grab a more concentrated paint, which I would call that heavy cream or even cream top-like ratio between water and paint. So I'm going to place these on the side. I'm going to dilute the colors with water, and then the next thing will be to wet the pumpkin. So I'm holding this long quill size 2 songbird brush, and I'm going to use it to wet the pumpkin. Now you have an option as well. So when you see these, where you see these highlights, right? There's a highlight here, here, there's a tiny one here and here and here. You can always use masking fluid for watercolors, or you can even use a wax stick. So this way for sure you will preserve the light there. The way I preserve the light when I do paint the whole thing wet on wet is I just stay away from those highlighted areas. So I'm just grabbing some water and now I'm applying it towards the pumpkin. Now my sketch lines are pretty dark, but it doesn't bother me because the pumpkin, the colors, like when you take a look at the reference, those colors are pretty intense. So you're not going to actually see any of these sketch lines. So I'm just going to wet it. I'm going to use the tip of my brush to go along these sketch lines. I don't want to go over the lines, because if you do, and you have water in the background, that means the paint will also bleed towards the background. So actually it is important to take your time here wetting the pumpkin and to stay on the inside of the pumpkin. Of course, there's other ways to paint pumpkins. You can wet the entire background as well and just apply colors wet on wet with that heavy cream to cream top-like ratio between water and paint, so the paint doesn't spread much. And then you would have that nice glow in the background as well once it dries, and then you can add another layer. I've done it this way too, and I do like it. So that's just another option, right? We're doing it in a little easier way. So we're just wetting the inside of the pumpkin. And if you worry about getting too close towards the edges and you can't really see much because of the light, let's say, then stay a little farther away from those lines, because once you have the color on your brush, then it will be much easier to get to those lines and you be able to see like how far you're going with the paint. So this way you won't go over. Because once you have some water over the edges, then again the paint will travel there too. So a little more water. I do take my time wetting the paper, and it's important because you want your paper to be nice and wet. Now this is the Collection watercolor paper, and this is actually my favorite watercolor paper. I can paint in layers here, and when you do paint this pumpkin with layers, for example, you do want to use this paper because then you'll be able to add that second layer without lifting the previous layers. Yes, you can still lift a little bit of the colors, which is the benefit of painting on this paper. That's the beauty about this paper, that you can still lift a little bit, but you also have no issues with adding that second layer. Of course, it also depends from the paints you're using, because some colors, some pigments are just very easy to lift, so it doesn't matter what paper you would use, you would still lift a little bit. So I'm just wetting, and this is going to be 2 layers again, and I do recommend to paint on this paper so you can easily add that second layer without lifting the previous colors. However, we're not going to re-wet for that second layer, we're just going to add the patches. So that will be actually the second layer. So the first layer is when you strip that pumpkin out of all these patches and you're just focusing on the yellow, as if this pumpkin was just yellow. So forget about any of these dark green patches or orange patches. This at the moment does not exist. So you're just gonna apply colors as if the pumpkin was yellow. So I'm just wetting it. I'm gonna take my time wetting it because I do want to have enough time to apply the colors wet on wet, because the longer you wet the paper, the more time you will have to apply the colors wet on wet. So we're going to start with these blue undertones for the highlights. I have this phthalo blue right here, tiny bit of quin red, and I'm going to apply this towards the highlights, wherever I can see a little bit of the blue, which this is a little too much. So I'm just wiping my brush on a towel first, and then I'm going to apply a little too much too. So just apply it towards the areas, wherever you can see those highlights. Now, if it's too much, you can also go through it. You can spread the paint, and then a little bit over here too, just to have a little bit, tiny bit of that blue. That would be pretty nice. So just kind of let it spread a little bit. The thing is that the paint will spread anyway because we're painting wet on wet, unless we're using like this heavy cream or cream top-like ratio between water and paint. So these are the areas where I want some of that blue color to show that there's those highlights. I'm adding a little more blue here, actually, just tiny bit more blue, just so I can see it later. Because the thing is that everything dries more pale than when we first see it when it's wet on the watercolor paper, and that's why I'm okay to add a little more of that color. I got a little chunk of some red paint, but I'm just gonna spread it a little bit. And so I'm adding also a little bit of that blue towards the handle. Now, if you don't have enough water in your brush and the brush is too damp, then you might actually end up removing water from the paper. So just be careful with that. So I'm cleaning my brush, and now I'm going to start grabbing the yellows. This is my Untitled yellow, some of the ISO yellow, but I also want some of the raw sienna. So I'm gonna grab some raw sienna too. I'm not trying to mix these colors on the palette. I want to see the separation of colors. So I do want the colors to separate. Now this is important here. So we do need to have some highlights. Even sometimes it's hard to see, like in this actually picture. We do have those highlights, the strong highlights going through those pieces, but it's not like we have one area that's or side that's super highlighted. So sometimes we just need to exaggerate things just to make them look good as a painting. I'm grabbing a little more of that raw sienna and then the other yellows. So I have the Untitled yellow, then some of the ISO yellow as well, just tiny bit, small amounts. And what I'm trying to grab is more like a half and half like ratio between water and paint. And then if you want to right away just to add more color towards the bottom, you can do that too, and you kind of pull the paint upwards a little bit, right? And you change the ratio between the colors. So right now, like I grabbed a little more of the Untitled yellow, and you can go next to these highlighted areas too. It's just you want to be careful to not cover them. and just go next to them instead. And then around the handle, I do have this nice yellow. So I don't care about any like of these patches, right? All I'm thinking about is this yellow color that I see over the pumpkin, and it's just different shades of yellow. That's why we're mixing colors as we're applying the colors towards the pumpkin. So we're grabbing different shades. So this is my imidazzle yellow, tiny bit of iso yellow, and then this is actually the combo of yellow ochre and raw sienna. And I'm just finding areas wherever I want to add these yellow tones. And this, like, it's spreading. The paint is spreading. I want to say I'm trying to grab like this half and half like ratio between water and paint. So think of like that creamer for your coffee. The thing is that because I'm using a quilt brush and the paper is pretty wet, the paint is still spreading. But if you want to have more control, then you want to go towards like the heavy cream like ratio, what I like to call heavy cream, because then that means the paint is even more concentrated, so there's less water. So now I'm grabbing a little more. So this area here, right here, this part, actually, this is going to have an orange patch. I might as well just add more of the yellow in there, right? It's going to be all orange anyways. Might as well just add the color here and then go to other areas, whatever I'm going to add that orange patch, which is like right here too. I don't have enough water actually in my brush. And like I said, if you don't have enough water, what can happen is you start removing water from the paper, and that causes the paper to dry faster. So here I'm finding other areas that need a little more of that yellow. Actually, all of these areas do have yellow. It's just that I don't want to cover too much because I want to make sure that there's some highlights in there. And I changed the ratio between colors because I do want to see the different shade of that yellow. So like sometimes, like right now, I have a little more of, let's say, the raw sienna in my brush, right? Now I don't want to forget about those highlights, so I'm going to stay away from them, but very gently cruising around. And when you do cruise around like this from one area to another, you actually end up keeping your paper wet longer. And that's important too, right? Because the paper dries, and we do want to have that chance to apply these colors before the paper dries, so we don't have to like add the second layer, for example, for the yellows. Sometimes like it's fine, like of course actually with second layer you end up smoothing the previous layer and you actually create a little more contrast sometimes, or it depends how you place the colors too. But with the second layer it's like things get smoother, and also I add more vibrancy. So it just depends how long you want to paint, I guess, and how far you want to go with that painting. So now I'm starting to mix in a little bit of quin red. So I have raw sienna, yellow ochre, some quin red, and the two yellows, but I'm not trying again to mix these colors on the palette. So it's all happening like on the paper here. So I do want to see like some colors separating. So here I am adding this shade of orange, right, that I just created because I started adding some of the quin red. And this helps to shade it at the same time, because the pumpkin, like when I take a look at the pumpkin with light shadows, like the shade changes. So everything is just affected differently by light and shadows. It just depends what angle it is, right, and how we see it. So I took the photo so I can look at the pumpkin right now. It's always easier for me though to paint from the photo than if I place that pumpkin in front of me. Actually, it's much easier to just kind of figure out the colors and everything. Even though like I'm not moving the object, it's still easier for me to paint from the photo than the object in front of me, the pumpkin, because then it's easier for me to figure out the colors. So here I have more of that orange, and that's why I'm adding a little bit. It's like you don't really have to add that orange, but why not to change the shade of that yellow that we keep adding more and more yellow, right? We're shading this pumpkin. So might as well just add more or some of the yellow or orange just to change the shade of yellows basically. Now what I want is to add a little more of the imidazzle yellow, but I don't have enough water, so I just diluted more color with water. And I want to go back here. Now what's happening is that the pumpkin is drying, so I had to wipe my brush on a towel. I had a little too much, and I still have a little too much of the water. What I'm going to do is squeeze more paint. I'm going to squeeze more paint. And I'm going to grab this. What I tried to grab is more like a heavy cream-like ratio between water and paint, and go back towards the brighter, like a more yellowish areas. So this is more like between heavy cream, I want to say, and cream top-like ratio between water and paint. So the paint is more concentrated with water, and now you can see that there's this yellow popping more. The thing is that I can't have more water with on the brush, because that's the best, like the easiest way to just to create a bloom. So you have to be very careful. So whenever you introduce more color or new color, you actually don't want to have much water on your brush. You want to have more like a between, I say, heavy cream and cream top-like ratio. So the ratio between water and paint. I do have a video on my channel where I explain these ratios if you need a little more help. But now we can see some orange, we can see some yellow, and I'm just grabbing a little more of that imidazzle yellow. And then this is between heavy cream and cream top-like ratio. And I am going through the areas that are already like kind of finished painting in a way, but it's still like perfectly wet where I can add the color and I'm not creating any blooms because it's still flowing. Things are still flowing nicely here. Not for too long though, because for example, like this area seems a little drier than that area. So I'm actually gonna skip it and I'm gonna apply the color instead, like right in here and then here. And I'd like to grab some quin red with a dirty brush, quin red, and then back to that ISO or imidazzle yellow. So I created again that shade of orange. So everything is done like whenever I add these colors, I don't have much on my brush, and right now, like the brush does not have much water. So I'm not creating any blooms because it's very easy to create a bloom at this stage of painting. Very easy to create a bloom. So what I'd like to do, one last thing before we walk away from it and let it dry. So we started with the blue undertones for the highlights, and then we started with the imidazzle yellow, ISO yellow, raw sienna yellow ochre, right? We're not adding yet the brilliant orange or whatever orange of your choice you have. That's for later. But what we could do is grab a little bit of green. I have some of this soft green. You want to grab paint that's barely diluted with water, and you can find some areas. Actually, it would be a great idea to blend a tiny bit with that imidazzle yellow and find some areas that are still wet where it just feels wet, damp, at least damp, and then add this heavy cream, or actually not heavy cream, this is like a cream top-like ratio, so the paint is barely diluted with water, and you just add spots. So this is actually a very good timing also to lift colors, but we're not lifting here unless we let's say lost the highlights. Then yes, we would want to lift colors. But you're grabbing this almost what feels like a paste, the paint, and this way the paint will not spread, but that's not almost like the main idea of it. The main idea is so we don't create any blooms. So more of that green with that yellow. Right here, I'm just grabbing like a dry paint, soft green with that imidazzle yellow. Actually, it feels more like a hooker's green. I do have some of that color there too, by the way. And then here I'm just gonna place in some of these areas. I just want something with green. Sometimes like I'll add a color, like even though I should probably wait till the next layer, or I don't like have to wait till the next layer, but it's like I can definitely wait, but I decide to add it with this layer, for example. That's because I want this to dry with the yellows, to spread a little bit. So I have this kind of like a greenish undertone, especially for the areas where I'm going to add these patches. And then I'm going to have a patch here, for example, right? I'm going to have a patch right here. So maybe some of that yellow, green. This is a yellow green because I actually added some of the imidazzle yellow there as well. So a little bit of that. I don't have much paint anymore left. So I'm grabbing dry paint. This is literally dry paint. And I'm just adding it. As long as I don't dip my brush in water, and like even if I wiped it on a towel, it's fine. But the thing is, I would still have too much water. It just needs to be like, feel it out. So you really got rid of that water from the brush. It's just like a drier paint, but I mean, the brush needs to be damp because it needs to be formed, right? If you just have a dry brush like this one, this is my quill size 4 songbird. If I don't dip it in water, this is what it looks like. But if I dip it in water, there's the nice shape right away, right? The thing is that you want to make sure that there's not much water in that brush anymore when you do this. So another thing what we could do is grab a little bit with that tip of your brush. This is that damp brush, right? And then some of the Van Dyke Brown dry paint, just grab it with the tip of your brush and add it next to this handle. Maybe a little more. I need a little more of the Van Dyke Brown. I'm literally grabbing dry paint. This is just dry paint. And I'm adding a shadow right next to this handle. But I need way more of the Van Dyke Brown. This is so dry. I just want drier paint, but the brush is still slightly damp. And then I just want some Van Dyke Brown. Just a little bit, so I have that shadow, but so it has some of these colors too. You can kind of pull it a little bit, although we're gonna use like the sap green and indigo for that, but you can still like kind of pull in those directions as well if you want to. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Another thing what we could do is splatter a little bit of a paint in here, for example. So I'll give you an idea, like show you what you can do. This is optional, and it's just because I'm waiting for this to dry. But you could have like this is a mini mop brush, so it's kind of like a mop brush, but it's very small. I like to use this brush to splatter paint. This is just a mini mop by Princeton. It's a smaller size, and I dip it in water. I wipe it on a towel, maybe a little more water, and I go through this drier paint. So drier paint, what I'm trying to achieve is more like I'd say half and half like ratio, but a very small amount on the brush. And then you kind of rub it off your finger and you start seeing the splatter, right? So I guess I don't want the splatter on the background. I got some splatter there, but the idea is to have these little granules like of paint there. And if you want this to splatter more, like you just want to have like maybe more water, but you want to feel it out, and I suggest to actually test it out on the side just so you know like how things work with a smaller brush when you splatter. This is good because it's just kind of like has so much hair there, and it's not a pointy brush. It's just I rub it off my finger, and that's how I splatter the paint. If you do need to lift, this is actually a perfect timing to lift the colors. So I don't really need to lift because I have these highlights. But let's say this one is a little hidden. Let's say I grab this small brush size 2, and I'm just gonna go through this area until I see something lifting. Now, to lift colors, I do also have a video on my channel about how to lift colors. You want to have a damp brush, but it's about the paper, how wet the paper is. So the paper is still slightly wet, just the damp paper. And you want to wait until the shine goes away from the paper. Once that shine is gone, that's when you dip your brush in water. You wipe it on a towel first, and then you can start lifting. So here could be another idea, let's say. Now, if you don't see anything, well, first of all, it could be a paper too, but this paper is beautiful. Like this paper is great for lifting. So I'm just lifting colors, and I could lift a little bit here too. So this is perfect timing to lift colors. I have a highlight here already. I guess I could try to lift a little bit here. I like to lift with rigger brushes a lot, and that's another option if you want to practice some more, especially if you're an animal painter. And because using a rigger brush, you can add so many like highlighted hairs. So there you go. And I'm just gonna leave it. I'm gonna wait for it to dry, and then we're going to start working on that second layer, which is those patches. So for that, we're gonna use sap green, we're gonna use some Van Dyke Brown, and then we're going to use some indigo. So let's walk away from it and let it dry. Hey everyone, so everything is dry, so I might as well start adding those orange patches first. Why orange patches? Because once you have the orange patches in, you can still change the shape of these patches because you would be adding later the dark green indigo-like patches, and so you can always reshape them just by adding the green tones, the patches over the pumpkin. So this is my imidazzle yellow here, and another thing is I want these to be painted wet on dry, so that means I need way more water with my paint, so it's more like a water-like ratio. This is my brilliant orange here. So water-like ratio, so the paint is quite diluted with water. And you can feel it out because this is still wet on dry. So you can take your time too. This is a smaller area. I have a small brush size 2. And there's a smaller area right here. And then if you want to make it, let's say darker, you add, so you can change the shade of yellow. So first I'm adding like this, I'm using this imidazzle yellow, some ISO yellow, but then you can add this orange, so the brilliant orange that I have, for example, or any orange of your choice, and we can change the shade of it just by adding, let's say now, some of that brilliant orange, but not too much. I don't want to add too much because this orange is actually quite opaque. This is like a really opaque orange, and it just feels that way, and I just want a little bit just to help me change the shade of it, of that orange, just a little bit. And I can add a drop here too, just a little bit. This way I can slightly shade it a little bit, maybe a little more. And how about like tiny bit of quid red, since this side of this patch seems much richer, and so we do want to change the shade. Even though, let's say you turn that pumpkin and you look at that patch and it looks just orange, plain orange, the thing is that because of the light and shadows, that orange is affected differently from each side. So now I have this bigger one right here, and here I can see that some of these yellow patches going over, like through the orange parts, right? The orange patch. So I'm going to avoid those. So I'm going to show you what I'm going to do. I'm going to grab this imidazzle yellow. So this is imidazzle yellow with some of the other yellows, and I'm going to find those patches. So let's say I want one here, right there, and then right here. So I'm not coloring, not adding this color everywhere, just some areas. And then let's say I want more of that yellow, especially here. I grabbed way too much paint, so I just let that flow over there. This is imidazzle yellow that I just grabbed, but I want this to be still wet, so I need to go through it because I'm not done adding colors. I want this patch to be a little more orange. So now I'm gonna grab this. This is my brilliant orange and some of this ISO yellow. And why not to add that quid red too? Make it really nice and orange-like. I gotta make sure I don't have anything on my finger. I feel like I just grabbed some paint. But the more orange-like areas, so this is where you want to definitely add that color, a little more of the imidazzle yellow. So I'm mixing colors as I go, as I'm applying these colors towards the paper. And the paper is nice and wet. So now, once I have the colors I want, I can also go through it and spread the paint, move it. But I did preserve some of these areas to stay like this yellow, with that yellow undertone that I first applied towards the pumpkin. So I'll move the paint. So once you apply color, you can always go through the areas very gently with that brush and manipulate how the paint will dry. Now another patch is right here. So this patch is much bigger, larger, and I am going to add a little bit of water in the middle so the paint doesn't dry too fast, even though this is going to be mostly wet on dry, right? But I do want this to stay wet longer, so that's why I'm adding water in the middle section. And I actually am gonna use this round 8 brush, golden one. And the thing is that I have those yellow patches that have to go through the orange patch. So I'm gonna start with this yellow here. And then the middle section is wet again. And here I need to find these yellow patches now. So I'm designing these yellow patches, let's just say this way. And then here, some yellow here and there, preserving the areas to stay yellow like we see them. Go, and then on top of that I'm going to add the other yellow, so ISO yellow, and some of the let's say orange. The orange I have. So this is imidazzle yellow, but I think I just grabbed, it was so instinctively that I just grabbed also some of the ISO yellow. Just so I changed the shade of that orange. So this is my imidazzle yellow, some of the ISO yellow, tiny bit of that orange, a little more of the orange, but also I'd like some quin red right here to make it richer. So as you see, I'm very quickly grabbing colors from the palette because I want the colors to mix here on the paper. So colors look rich and nice, and colors just separate. So I see different shades of yellows. That's the main goal. Go. There needs to be some brown in there too, actually. Just something going through the middle. I'm gonna grab some of the like a heavy cream-like ratio between water and paint of the yellow, and at the same time I'm pushing the paint. I'm gonna wipe my brush on a towel. I didn't clean it, and I'm just going through this, something like that. And I'm gonna clean this brush. I'm gonna wipe it so I don't forget. I'm gonna grab a smaller brush, so my size 2. And I'm gonna grab this thicker imidazzle yellow with some of this bright, brilliant orange. And then I'm gonna grab this also burnt sienna, and let's go for this drier Van Dyke brown. And I'm gonna go through this middle section right here. But you know what? It calls for a little bit of red too. So I just grabbed some of the quin red as well. And I'm mostly applying it towards the right side. I'm shading it this way. And then with the tip of my brush, this is a dirty brush, I'm just gonna grab a tiny bit of dry paint, which is the sap green. I just grab that sap green, and I'm just gonna go close to these edges, just like I see it in the reference. So these are little things that you don't really have to do, but if you want to get closer a little bit to what we see in the reference, because your pumpkin will look pretty anyway, just the way it is. It's just that if you want to do something extra. So I just grabbed this drier sap green. That's all I did. And just to add it towards those areas. I'm cleaning my brush. And actually what I'm going to do is another thing is squeezing this Van Dyke brown onto my palette. This is literally fresh paint out of a tube. I'm going to grab a tiny bit with the tip of my brush. This is just a damp brush. And I'm going to drop some of that paint, like touch it with that drier paint. Just there, a little bit. I should have done it here too, so I still can. I just want to make sure that there's no water on the ferrule of the brush. And then I'm grabbing with the tip of my brush the dry paint. And I'm going to do the same thing. Just apply it with tiny, tiny, tiny drops. Or drops, like you just apply a little bit of paint just to make it a little darker too. How about here? Maybe over there. But this is much drier like now. And then if the paint, let's say from the middle, spreads too much, then you want to go through on the left side of it, kind of push the paint towards the right side. And then wipe your brush on a towel and then go right next to it, just to manipulate how it's going to dry. I feel like I could add a little more of the orange, some Van Dyke brown, burnt sienna, and quin red towards the right side. There you go. But heavy cream-like ratio between water and paint, so the paint doesn't spread. Actually, the middle section is right here. I keep pushing the paint this way. So one more time. The orange, yellow, Van Dyke brown, some burnt sienna, quin red, thick paint, or not thick, but it's like a cream top-like ratio between water and paint. And I just want to shade it a little more to direct this more this way. And now I lost those little tiny pieces that I had of that Van Dyke brown, so I'm grabbing it again and dropping it right there to make it a little darker. Perfect. So I'm going to clean this brush. This has to dry. These parts have to dry, but that doesn't mean that I can't start painting, like adding those green patches towards these areas right there. I can. So there's 2 ways to do it, or more ways. But what you could do is grab masking fluid for watercolors and mask all the yellow areas that you can see. Now that's the most freeing way to do it, because once you have masking fluid in this pumpkin, and then you wet the whole pumpkin and you apply only the dark green / indigo blue, then you don't have to worry about like staying away from these yellow areas because there's masking fluid. And then the last step would be to remove the masking fluid. So we can do it this way. Or you're just going to paint all these patches individually and just changing the ratios between water and paint, but also the ratios between the colors itself. So it's up to you. I've been debating like which way I want to go, but since I already painted these wet on dry, then I think I'm just gonna do it wet on dry as well, and just to make it a little more simple too, without using the masking fluid for watercolors. So you want to have your colors diluted with water ahead of time. So this is my sap green, indigo here, and you want this to be between water and milk-like ratio, actually more like a milk-like ratio, but so you can mix colors as you go. And then there is Van Dyke brown. And then there's my Van Dyke brown. So all these colors, I'm gonna be mixing them as I go. So because these elements are slightly wet, I guess this is already dry. This is kind of dry, but this is wet. I'm gonna start from the top and I'm gonna kind of go this way. So I could grab a little bit of yellow too as an undertone. There's my green. I want actually plenty of water here. And I don't care about a perfect color mix. That's not important at all. I just want this to be kind of diluted with water, and so I can grab these, the paint that's more like a water-like ratio, basically, or between milk and water-like ratio. But of course, it will feel a little different when you apply it. At first, it just seems dark, right? So it seems like almost like I have thicker paint, but it's just once the paint dries, it won't feel this way. It won't look like that. I want this to be transparent. And then if I want to make it darker on one side, then I'll add some indigo on that side, for example. And then I do need to do a lot of rinsing because I need to change the ratios between water and paint, sometimes milk-like ratio, sometimes water-like ratio. But I also want different shade of the green. So right now this is more like a sap green, and it became more transparent. So I also want to shade it properly. And then I could add some, I was just thinking, blue. The blue would look nice, but this is too much blue. So I'm grabbing some of the indigo, and I have sap green. And then I'm just adding these patches, shading too, these patches. So some areas need to be more transparent, and some areas of these patches need to be feel like richer. So this one side is, for example, a little richer than this side right here. But then this side, I'm going to make it a little richer again. So this will have a little more of the indigo, for example. Now, if I have like this much paint, of course, this will bleed this way a little bit. So maybe I need to switch to a ratio that's milk-like ratio. So this is more like a milk-like ratio. And then it's also a matter of how much I want to touch this left side. But I'll continue here, adding the paint. You can do this fast, like without thinking much about it, or you can spend some time. But what's more important is actually the ratio between water and paint. So some areas need to be darker and some areas need to be a little lighter and feel more airy, like transparent. So this feels overall darker, at least darker. And then we have this right here. Then I'm shaping the pumpkin at the same time when I go over or closer towards the edges. There you go. And then I'm going to start again a little heavier here with the indigo on this right side. So I'm changing the ratios between colors, and if I have to lift, I will lift colors. Like it would be nice to actually lift this area here or this middle section here. So if I remember, I'll come back to it on time. The timing is crucial because otherwise there's no lifting. So the best time to lift colors is right before the paper is too dry, so that shine goes away. Now I want this to be a little more transparent here. So more water. If I want the paint to be a little more transparent, that means I need to grab the paint that has a little more water, or just slightly dip my brush in water and grab that water and add it to the paint that's already on my palette. And then I'm just gonna shape these, and I'm gonna have to take a break, like a quick visual break in a second, just in case I want to lift something, because if you just keep moving, you get sidetracked very fast, and then you forget about potential lifting. So the areas where you could lift. And let's see, it's this side. It needs to be a little darker. So there you go. I'm gonna grab more of the Van Dyke brown and with the indigo here, because I want to create a contrast as I go too. So I hope this makes sense, but one side of this area, the patches, needs to be a little lighter, like the left side. Let's say the left side here, or here it becomes more like a right side. This is right side, and so you have to see how the light is hitting it. And then we have these here, so I have to start lifting if I want to lift in just a second. This is where we have highlights. I don't want to add too much. And then there's this other patch, so I'm going to come back to it. I'm going to clean this brush first, wipe it on a towel. I'm going to grab a stiffer, smaller brush, and just so I can time it for lifting. So it would be right here, just to lift a little bit. And then there's this middle section. This is a little early actually for lifting, but I'm afraid I'm going to forget. So no matter what, you wipe your brush on a towel first, because if you don't, then there will be a bloom when you try to lift. There you go. So I lifted a little bit. Now I'm going to continue, and it almost feels like I need to add more water to the paint because it dries so fast. A little bit more, and then I also want this to have like I guess the bottom part is where I want to add the darks. So now I'm gonna clean the brush, wipe it on a towel, and just focus more on like a transparent paint to add here from the top. And this is also a way to shape these pieces if you want to add some color there too. And we just keep moving. So more of that sap green. This is way too much water, so if I touch this, that will start flowing over there. So I needed to adjust the ratio, but I can also stay away from this part, and then once I lift, that gap will close. It's one way to do it, to preserve that light in there. There you go. And let's see, there's the middle section, and it feels like I should add some more of the indigo. Again, these are the same colors. I'm just switching, like changing the ratios between colors that I'm using, depending on like how dark the area needs to be. So now I grabbed like this mix here, but I need more of the indigo here. I want more of the indigo and some of the Van Dyke brown too. And then this connects in a way there. And there's smaller lines too, so something that I need to remember. These patches. So shading is very important to change the ratio between colors, since one side is lighter and the other side is a little darker. And then let's see, on this side, this seems more highlighted, so why not to actually make this much more transparent? I'm staying away from it because I know I'll just create a bloom, since I have like water-like ratio there, right next to this one, which is milk-like ratio. Because I can close these gaps later. Grabbing a little more of milk-like ratio this time. And you don't have to like add these patches everywhere. That's not that crucial. Like you don't have to even add these patches at all if you already like your pumpkin, because I was looking at the pumpkin, the first layer, and I liked the way it turned out. So I'm like, well, I would be okay if I just finished the painting already, but I want to show you how to create these patches, because they're just different from the pumpkins I painted. I guess I did paint one like this in my recent class. There you go. And then we have this orange. I actually forgot about this orange part. Let's see how it looks like without that layer of the orange that I added afterwards, because these are the patches that I added, but here I forgot to add it. We'll see how it turns out if I need to add it at all. So I just keep going, and you keep going until you're finished, until you've gone around. And this is still slightly wet, so I'm gonna go back here. I have to be careful with my hand though, so I don't touch this. And now this is a little darker, so I'm grabbing this indigo and sub green, Van Dyke brown. There's actually something like brownish there, which I wasn't really paying attention to. But something to consider if you want to add it, like a little Van Dyke brown with maybe I don't know, Van Dyke brown and some burnt sienna. That would be fine. There you go. Just going down, moving down. I'd like to make it a little darker on this side, so I just need to grab heavy cream-like ratio between water and paint. And why is that? Is because this is already wet, so this became wet on wet. So you start, let's say, wet on dry, but then if you add paint on top of it, then it becomes wet on wet. So then you just adjust the ratio between water and paint. So more of that paint. And I'm going to travel this way. But I feel like I need more of the indigo, so I'm just grabbing some indigo. Or not indigo, I'm sorry. I actually grabbed phthalo blue red shade, which is optional too. And then I have all these patches. So first of all, I'm going to start here. And it looks like there's actually a lot of the yellow areas not covered. So I don't want to do too much. It's so easy to just cover too much. There we go. I'm going to go close to these orange patches now. And just keep moving. And then I'm going to, let's see, start here with this one. And it feels more, I guess, like indigo. So that means, to me, that means that with that sap green and Van Dyke brown, the main color will be actually the indigo. A little more concentrated paint. There we go. These patches here seem like they're highlighted, and I should have some more highlights there too. So some of the green with the blue, for example, and very light value. But I'm not there yet, so I'm just going to continue working on these. And this is wet, this one, but this is not wet. So it's kind of like I'm going here, touching these areas that are already wet, or I'm sorry, already dry. Go. So I'm shaping this orange patch this way. And this needs some phthalo blue, so I just grabbed some phthalo blue. And I'm trying to see how I'm going to connect the pieces. I'm going to clean this brush, wipe it on a towel, so it's just a damp brush. And I'm just using like a diluted paint, I'm sorry, that water, just a damp brush. And I'm diluting this paint. So then I can show some highlight in there. And if you want to make the other ones a little darker, you can come back if it's not dry yet and add some paint. So what else? This needs to be a little darker right here. A little more of that indigo. The paint on my palette has dried, so I just need to add water to it. But that part needed to be a little darker. I'm cleaning my brush, wiping on a towel, and I'm going to tackle this side, but I need to add more water to my paint. It's all wet on dry, most of it, so I do want the paint to be actually diluted with water. And then if you do find yourself that you need to actually lift the areas, you would lift them, but here I left the gaps, so I'm just re-wetting the areas right in the middle here. I'm going through the middle sections, so I do have highlights, and I'm just gonna re-wet this one here, so you can still see like it's lighter, and if it's not light enough, you can lift. So you can go through the area and just kind of press a little harder with your brush to bring that highlight back. So here I could do that, for example, just to bring a little bit of that highlight back in there. But I'll continue moving here. So for example, this side, the right side, is a little darker, right? So I'm going to go with more like a milk-like ratio between wet and paint. I am going to leave that little space there. I'm gonna go right next to this patch. This has dried. And this is not dark enough, so I'm gonna grab this cream top-like ratio between wet and paint of the colors I use, so Van Dyke Brown, Indigo, Sap Green, and just add it on top of the wet paint. So that became wet on wet. There you go. And that, I don't want to make this too busy. Like, I mean, it's busy when you look at the pumpkin. Of course, it's busy with all these patches. But what I guess tried to say is that I don't want to lose too much of the yellow areas. And this is where I was saying that you can shape these orange patches right now. Like you can change the shape of these patches because you're applying a darker color. So like right now I'm applying this combo of these colors to create this darker green, and I can change the shape of this patch. So I just grabbed some of the indigo just to have more indigo and sap green, and this needs to be a little darker, I suppose. And I also need to go in that same direction as I see these patches in a way so I can show that the pumpkin is rounded, is round. And then here, and then just go a little closer to the handle. And if I need to make it a little darker and it's still, the paint is still wet, then I can just add the color on top of it, and that becomes again wet on wet. So this would be more like a heavy cream, between heavy cream and cream top-like ratio, because I'm adding color towards the wet areas. But here this is dry, but I still want the color. So by the time I get to these drier areas, then I don't have that cream top or heavy cream-like ratio anymore. That's why I just keep going. Technically, this should be a little darker. So I'm going to grab more of the color. This is going to be wet on dry. It's just that I'm making it a little darker because it looks like it's a little more shadowed. Just to add a little color. Just to create a nice dimension there. And then here, I want this to be a little darker too. So I'm just adding a little color. This has dried. So this is wet on dry. Just a little more color. I'm staying away from the highlight though. And here too, if I want to add a color, I'm going to stay away from the middle section because that's where I have the highlight. Let's see, a little color here. This is all dried. It has dried. This has dried, so it's wet on dry. I'm just darkening some of these areas that need to be darkened. So this is subgreen mostly with the indigo. And that's all for the shading pretty much. I'm gonna clean this brush, wipe it on a towel. What I wanna do is grab a little bit with that damp brush. So I'm wiping it on a towel. I'm grabbing this kind of like a dry paint. What I wanna do is dry brush through a little bit here, because this is what we can see in that pumpkin. And this, we have this area too. It's kind of like you wanna actually drag it from the area where you applied the greens. So maybe some of the green will go down there too. But here it's like dry brushing. So when you dry brush, you hear it. So that's dry brushing. And then I can shade it over here too. Actually, I didn't add that layer, but it doesn't bother me that I didn't add the layer there. I'm gonna shade it a little bit there too. So it's dry brushing, just kind of drag the paint, but it would be nice to have a little bit of indigo, or not indigo, but Van Dyke brown. So I just grabbed Van Dyke brown. And then just shade it maybe over there. And then let's start working on the handle. So what we're gonna do is we're going to, same brush, so brown 2. I'm going to wet it. And now I'm going to apply first like an indigo with, let's see, a little bit of Van Dyke brown. I'm gonna add it towards like the bottom here, but I need more of the indigo because this does not feel blue. What I'm adding. This is wet on wet, right? And I'm going to clean the brush, and actually you can start the other way around. You could grab some of the Van Dyke brown, but cream top, and then some of the raw sienna, and just add it from the top a little bit. Wipe your brush on a towel, and just kind of manipulate how it's going to dry. But we have to wait for this to dry anyway, before we can add the final layer. And then a little more of the indigo. Just cream top-like ratio between wet and paint. There you go. So I can make that handle stand out a little bit. It's standing out anyway because of the shadows that we have around it. And then if I want to, again, this was supposed to be like a highlight here. I'm wetting it so it blends with the sides, right? If I need to make it darker, I'll make it darker. But I'm just using a damp brush to soften this. And then I can pull this paint a little bit so it looks prettier like this. There you go. So I'm just gonna wait for this to dry, and then I'm gonna finish the handle, and that's it. So the last step is let's finish this handle. So I'm holding a round brush too, and I'm going to first wet only the bottom part of this handle. So just this part. I don't even have to go all the way to that line on top here, because I can do that with the paint. And then I'm going to grab some cream top-like ratio between wet and paint. I guess between heavy cream and cream top. I'm trying to scoop some of this Van Dyke brown. And with a hard, so to have a hard edge, I also want some of the indigo. So Van Dyke brown, indigo, and I just want this harder edge right there on top, or right underneath this part here. And then we can add more color on the bottom here of the handle, and then grab this cream top-like ratio, so the paint is barely diluted with water, and you're just going to recreate some of that pattern that you see. So just drop a little bit of paint here and there, just a little bit. Now this part of the pumpkin, as you can see, it's much darker, so most of the heavy or cream top-like ratio between wet and paint goes right underneath here, right underneath this part. And then we can go a little bit here too. And this way we have our center. We really don't need to do much more to it. Of course, we could make this more, I guess, give it more of a shape, but we could also add some spots on top. If you want to, you can do that. But the pumpkin is pretty much done. Everything is pretty much done. I wanted to share with you what else you could do with your painting once you're done. First of all, like I did this again, I added the shadow, right? So I have a shadow here, I added a shadow here. Both shadows were painted wet on wet. So I would wet this part or over here underneath the pumpkin, and then I would apply colors wet on wet. I would use the same colors I used for the pumpkin with a little bit of blue and red, so like a blue violet. I would add some blue violet to it. Then I decided to experiment a little bit with the gold ink, and actually I had this gold powder, and I mixed it with water and I mixed it with gum arabic. So first mixed water with gum arabic, and then I added that gold powder, and then I mixed it, and this is the result of what it looks like. And I think it looks really pretty. So if you're planning to make cards, let's say you want to send it to someone, a friend or your family, then I think something like this looks really pretty. It just makes the painting a little more elegant too. So just a couple things what you could do. And what else you could do, you could add some gold over the pumpkin as well, but I didn't go that far. So thanks so much for your time, and please let me know if you have any questions.